The Mass Effect trilogy is probably my favourite series ever, easily beating Witcher, Cyberpunk, Elder Scrolls, Dragon Age. I would even put Yakuza in the mix maybe, and we could go on there, but the point is the companions that you had with you, the lore behind the game from a world building perspective and also from like a species perspective, it was genuinely, I would say, almost as good as it gets with RPG games within Mass Effect. And then with Mass Effect Andromeda, the graphics, the visuals were amazing, even though maybe the game itself wasn't exactly perfect. I don't think anyone would dispute that. But now we have Mass Effect 5 coming out, I'd love to talk about the release date and also what exactly we're expecting with the game. Now the first thing, and arguably most important thing that I'm going to mention here, is that a lot of the talent that bring you that Mass Effect trilogy that I think a lot of us really enjoy are now coming back to work on the next Mass Effect game. But there's some notable exceptions, including the co-creator of the original Mass Effect trilogy. He had his own little studio, but that got shut down like a few weeks ago, sadly. The next important thing to touch on here is Dragon Age Veilguard, which the devs have basically just come off creating and now are going into Mass Effect 5. That game was kind of a bit of a letdown for the audience. Apparently Dragon Age Veilguard took out a lot of the conflict, the moral greyness, the choices, the consequences. They even took out a lot of the romance options, the interactions between companions. And that's a shame because, for me at least, it seems like that's a lot of why people liked Dragon Age. And more so, to be honest, kind of like Mass Effect. I think people forget, but in Mass Effect 2 and 3, there was essentially a morality system where there was a lot of things that you could do that were kind of like small in scope, but moment to moment either gave you points towards Paragon or Renegade. And then there were larger macro choices as well. The Genophage with Mordin up in the tower. I won't say anything more, but there's things like that that happen that do have consequences. And to think of those kind of things, especially not being in the game, the next Mass Effect kind of would be wild to me. That's part of the core DNA of what makes the game great. As well as, to be honest, if you think about the Mass Effect characters, companions that you had, and even some of the NPCs you interacted with the exception of arguably the human characters, there was a lot of personality within the alien race companions that you had. There's a lot there, and apparently with Dragon Age Veilguard, they kind of fucked that up as well within that game. So I'm kind of just going into Mass Effect 5 with tempered expectations because they are coming off the back of, yes, Dragon Age, which wasn't received that well. I don't want to belabor that point too much, so now we're going to move on and we want to talk about the release date, because some people really care about that. So a lot of the concept art, figuring out exactly the overall macro things that the game's going to be focusing on, trying to figure out a direction for the game, was done in 2023. The devs said as much, but most of the devs that are now working on Mass Effect 5 wouldn't for the most part have even got started really until Mass Effect Veilguard got released, so we're like a few months into the game of Mass Effect 5, like actually in full production. The only silver lining here is there's no DLC planned for the game. So unlike with Cyberpunk and Starfield, they didn't release a DLC a year after the game's release, which usually is the AAA game dev meta, so I mean that's kind of good news to be fair. Oh, by the way, before Dragon Age Veilguard they actually made Anthem, which I'll show on screen now. It wasn't really that well received, and I only mention that because it took them 5 years between that game and Dragon Age, and so we could expect a similar 5-year gap. The only reason I actually think, to be honest, it's more like 3 years is because in between that, to be fair, from 2019 to 2021, a lot of the game dev studio would have been working on the Mass Effect trilogy remaster, or at least a decent portion of the game dev team. So like if I was a betting man, honestly, I'd say like 4 years probably for Mass Effect 5 to come out. So like 2029, which sounds really bad, maybe 2028. And that realistically is what I'd expect. I'd expect it really no earlier than 2027, but really 2028 is probably where we're going to be looking at here. Now we do generally know the direction of Mass Effect 5 and what they're going for, essentially because there was some like audio thing that the devs put out in 2022 that was then decoded. The fan theory seems to be that a human entity, maybe Cerberus, are going around and creating new mass relays. The one from 2022 seems to be the 7th, so that could maybe lead to like a power imbalance or whatever, and then that may be the focus of the next Mass Effect game. Maybe with us trying to thwart the progression of like an evil corporation again, like Cerberus or some other entity. That other entity could even be like a civil war type thing that maybe you're part of, trying to take down the infiltrated council. That kind of thing is what we're expecting. Basically, a struggle for power is essentially the dynamic that we're going into Mass Effect expecting. Or at least that's what I got from it. I'd love to hear what everyone else thinks. Now, to be fair, we did have also the cryptic YouTube trailer that basically shown what I can only imagine, because it's got the N7 logo on it, the main character, which is purposely got a helmet on, probably because it doesn't commit them to any one face to show in all the trailers, probably, to be honest. And then within the robe, it seems to be a nightclub, potentially afterlife, with a slew of different species which are seen in the picture. They did again double down on this whole shouldn't underestimate human defiance and all that kind of thing. So again, that kind of rebellion kind of aesthetic, or maybe again Cerberus doing something dumb. Really, that is the best theory that we currently have. They did also reference Andromeda, but to be honest, I really hope they just totally forget about it. Andromeda should not be a thing at all. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to think about it. I want to pretend it didn't exist. Although, to be fair, graphically and artistically, the game did look, I think, to be honest, pretty amazing. But that isn't really why people play the game, although definitely the species all looking cool certainly is nice. It's essentially additive to a good game rather than the core part of what makes a good Mass Effect game, and the core just was not there. And again, that's a whole video game review thing that maybe I'll cover at some point, but I'm sure it's been done a million times before, so maybe not, who knows. So yeah, for me, I am cautiously optimistic because cooler heads seem to be coming back to the studio. The game devs should have got any chip on their shoulder off by now because of Anthem and Dragon Age not being received that well. They got something to prove with Mass Effect, and I'm hoping they pull it off. I think they can. But again, given their past history, it definitely is not a given thing. Like with Grand Theft Auto, we kind of know that Grand Theft Auto 6 is at least going to be at a certain level. Likewise, when the CD Projekt Red releases a game, even though it may be a bit buggy, we do know it is going to be of a certain level of quality. BioWare these days does not have as much respect as they used to. Now look, I'd love to hear what everyone else thinks in the comment section. Subscribe and consider joining the Discord.